reading Piero Brunetta's History of Italian Cinema. Perhaps the Bible in terms of Old Testament and New, of everything that happened in one of the most vibrant cinematic industries of modern times. What Brunetta captures in the form of this extraordinary panorama of filmic creation is completely tied to the fortunes of history of Europe and the misfortunes and changes of Italy itself. You have to remember that Italy was fundamentally a very poor country, but one that was rich in creative practice. And the Italians have always been people who've been supremely interested in creative possibilities, whether it's in painting or literature or song or opera. What I really like about this book is that it begins to tell a story from an Italian critic's point of view of what happened when the period film that really began with films like, for example, Cabiria, one of the earliest of the 20th century, began to evolve and fold into the almost opposite kind of tradition, namely that of neorealism. And neorealism, of course, occurs because Italy, like so many other countries in the Second World War, was completely devastated. There were no real studios any longer. Cinecittà was destroyed. It was a disaster. It was very difficult to make any kind of film. So great filmmakers like Visconti and Vittorio de Sica and Rossellini, making films using non-professional actors, found themselves in the streets, not really being able to use any of the actual props. Everything was on location. And every one of these films was as tragic as it was philosophical. And that was neorealism. But come the 1960s, something begins to happen out of Italian cinema. Where does neorealism become somehow, for example, the Italian spaghetti western, which is another page in the many movements of tremendous influence that Italy had on international cinema? Italians were fabulous at being able to create films that delved into, in very intimate ways, the neurotic obsession of what it is to be Italian at a time of post-war angst and alienation. Where the French and the Germans kind of kept to themselves, sometimes the Italians, in a way, rather than be silent, went in an entirely different direction. They celebrated when there was even nothing left to celebrate about or celebrate with. That's how we ended up with films like La Dolce Vita, a kind of celebration of total emptiness. We have these characters who are looking in so many ways to try and find something that's not really there, but they're just celebrating anyway. And 8½, Fellini's great work, was another example. The premise there is like of that of a great director looking for something that doesn't even exist, and that's his next movie. So it was obvious to a lot of movie producers in Italy that they needed to get away from, let's say, this sort of hermetic, self-involved, pretty much totally withdrawn sense of sort of Italian expressionism that had happened at that time with self-absorption. And then they needed to go beyond. And so in order to do this, they reached out to Hollywood, and Hollywood was itself going through its own set of troubles trying to make its own films at that time. I mean, fundamentally, many of its films had to do with themes that were starting to leave the vogue, as it were, but they also had all kinds of budgetary problems. So the things that Hollywood was looking for were already available in Italy, which was basically cheap labor, plenty of land, and a lot of the terrain from which you could make things like westerns. And what Italy was looking for its own part was a kind of renewed legitimacy outside of strictly Italian audiences. And that turned out to be the beautifully successful combination where you have, for example, Sergio Leone and all the other sort of great directors of that time then turning to the greatest of all the American genres, the Western. And they didn't really work so well with the other genres like film noir or science fiction film, etc. But, I mean, they did make some of these, but what really took hold was this sort of swashbuckling, modern kind of romantic practice that was very much the genre of the Western film. Interestingly, as the Western began to die out in the United States, with the rise of the enfant terrible, the films by people like Nicholas Ray creating movies for the coming-of-age generation, and And for people who really weren't interested that much any longer in the kind of Western values of the 40s and 50s, that kind of film, Italy really, at that time then, filled a kind of tremendous hole because Europeans were still very interested in Westerns. And to this day, they still are. And anybody who made films in the 60s and 70s is still reaping and deriving great benefits, great rewards, maybe even great royalties. So it's a great, great story, the history of Italian cinema, and one that I'll return to again very shortly. Thanks.